yesterday. We reflected on how a changing climate and a changing economy are shaping our options and shaping our future. We received some terrific advice from the morning panel about who we're managing for, water for, how decision support, predictive modeling can serve as useful tools, how we can use those tools to stress test our water plan against an uncertain future. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to people talking to people. We revisited the breadth and depth of Montana water law and policy, mixing zones, exempt wells, water leasing, water compacts, exempt wells again, exempt wells again. We challenged some assumptions, like Senator Vinson's thought that water is a simple concept. It's much more complicated than that. We explored opportunities to connect conversations and agencies across the Great Divide, the water quantity, water quality divide. To me, part of that includes connecting acronyms, EPA, DEQ, DNRC, CWA, CEWA, with numbers, 303, 305, Cat 4B, Cat 4C, and Cat 4.5, which I thought was connected to NOAA, not water policy. So I learned a lot yesterday. Taking a step back, I might also add the following reflections. This is maybe just for me, but the other moderators only appear once on the agenda. And here I am again today. So obviously they were better negotiators than I am. But seriously, there were over 300 people in the room yesterday across the spectrum of users and managers and researchers, students, farmers, ranchers. It was just awesome. And that level of engagement and experience was exciting. Even the newspapers across the state took notes. So I don't know if you guys had a chance to read the papers this morning. But some really great articles about our conversations that we're having together. Connecting people, building knowledge, that's how good things get done. So I'm really excited about that. Something else that I reflect on is that there's not a single answer or idea that really emerged here. It takes all of us, all of our creativity, all of our experience, a role for all of us in the future that lies ahead. But even though there's not a single answer, I'd say we did talk about and hear about some guideposts that can help us on that road. And here I'm going to co-opt and maybe corrupt a little bit Dorothy Bradley's stars. She said that in the 70s, as they were working together, the stars really aligned to help big things happen. I'm not even sure I captured the stars correctly, but I'm going to reappropriate them. First, one of the things that she talked about was identity, just the sense that we're Montanans, we're Westerners. That identity is important in shaping how we think about the world and how we interact with each other. Connected to that is a second star she talked about, this idea of a shared philosophy. She had reflected on Leopold and Stegner and others. But what is our land, our water ethic today? What are those values that underpin the way we think about the land and water that we depend upon and how we relate to it? She also talked about our history. And to me, that's looking back on some of the milestones that they talked about yesterday, but also on some of those key events in Montana's history that help shape who we are and how we've gotten to where we are. Understanding why we're at this point in our history is critical to navigating that path forward. She talked about the value and the importance of having the right people. And I think not just people across the spectrum to come together, but people with the courage to provide vision and leadership. Who's going to do that for us? Is it the people in this room? I think that's one reason you're here. But it's also exciting to see how we're connecting across generations here. So that was a guiding star that I think we can build on and amplify while we have some time together. This wasn't a specific star, but she wove it into many stars, and that was the idea that we do need to find a way to integrate science, information, tools, innovation that help inform our decisions in a way that matches our values and helps us really make comprehensive decisions. And finally, and maybe the hardest thing, is that star about trust. How do we find ways to talk to each other even when we disagree with each other, to have that great debate and to find that path forward? So today, looking forward, really looking forward to doing some wayfinding with all of you today, using those stars as our guide, using your input and insights and experience. Or alternatively, as Steve Doherty said, so in the future, fix it. So turning the page for today, we've got an exciting panel this morning and a workshop that follows that. I'm delighted to introduce Lara Hansen, who's going to lead us through that conversation. She's the Chief Scientist and Executive Director at EcoAdapt. She thinks climate change is everybody's problem. And her desire for action led her to co-create EcoAdapt with a team of folks back in 2008. She's written some incredible books. She's also co-created an engaged stakeholder process to help individuals, organizations, and communities create adaptation strategies applicable to their own work. She's helped produce this online tool that I've used myself. It's the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or ktex.org. She was part of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She's a Schweitzer Environmental Fellow. Just done a lot of incredible work. Before founding EcoAdapt, she was the Chief Climate Change Scientist for the World Wildlife Fund and a research ecologist with the EPA. One thing I learned about Lara yesterday, though, is that when she was a little girl growing up in Iowa, all the other little boys and girls were talking about what do they want to be when they grow up. She said, I want to be a sheep farmer in Montana. So welcome to the stage, Lara. Welcome home.
Yeah, I didn't manage to become a sheep farmer. I learned several things on the path to becoming a sheep farmer. One, I don't know anything about sheep. And two, I have no disposition for caring for things that can't talk to me and tell me what it is they need or want. I've taken you to the end of, I've taken you to this afternoon. Look at that, we went through a time warp. Okay, good morning. So great to see all of you back again for a second day. Yesterday was not what traditionally happens at meetings like this. Generally, meetings like this, you end day one feeling incredibly depressed, like everything has gone terribly wrong. The future is not the rosy future I wanted. I will never be able to retire and have my sheep farm in Montana. But hopefully, you didn't leave yesterday that way, because I know that I certainly didn't. We already got a lot of inspirational stories of ways people are incorporating the realities of the future into their work. I have not made this a pretty presentation. Note to self, PC is still not my friend. Okay, so I want to start this because I'm going to talk about climate change. And yesterday we talked a bit about climate change, but I know from work I've done previously in Montana and from chatting I had at social events, how many people in this room have difficulty talking to other people in Montana or themselves don't like talking about climate change? Hands, anybody? I know there are some people because I heard this yesterday. So when I say climate change, if in fact that's not something you're comfortable with, just go, when I say climate, go blah, 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 and just hear the change part. Because really that's the important piece here. And if you don't like either one of those words, as was said right before me by Sean, just hear me say the word future instead. So this is a little bit of an imagination exercise for you as well, if that's the case. But the important thing I want you to end this morning's session with, which is me talking at you for a while on the basics of climate change adaptation, and then a wonderful panel with 6 case studies of how they've incorporated climate change or the future into the work they do, and then an exercise for all of you in how you can improve the work you do. So hopefully that will leave you with something inspirational to move forward with. And I was really excited that so much of what I'm going to share with you this morning, the groundwork was laid for me so solidly yesterday. So I'm going to start with my favorite Amory Lovins quote, which is, "There is no box." And yesterday, the number of times I go to a meeting where someone has talked about stationarity before me is very small, so I am still very excited. So yesterday, it was told in at least 2 talks that stationarity is dead. And really, this is what the Amory Lovins quote is about. People used to say you should think outside the box, but the issue is with stationarity being dead, there really never was a box. The box was kind of make-believe from the get-go. And so the way you think about water systems in Montana, a lot of the assumptions that were part and parcel of how models were created, how management was designed, really aren't true anymore if they ever were. And we need to start rethinking how we engage in management decisions, policy decisions, personal decisions, with the understanding that there's no box. The other thing I love about this, and Sean, thank you for saying this as well, is the opportunity for creativity that suddenly opens up. One of the reasons that I'm a scientist, and this is not going to sound like it makes any sense to most people, except hopefully some other scientists, I actually love the creative opportunity of science. Science fundamentally is about asking creative questions so you can look at things differently and try and learn basic things about the world around us. And hopefully those basic things can actually be applied. So I love thinking about the fact that there is no box and that lots of assumptions we have need to be tested and explored. Fundamentally, I am still 3 years old. So I'm also going to do a couple of definitions because I'm going to use these two words, and these two words get used by a lot of people to mean very different things. So for the purposes of the next 25 minutes, mitigation is going to mean anything you do to reduce the causes of climate change, which are things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the second is adaptation, which is how we respond to, prepare for, and when possible, reduce the effects of climate change. Essentially, you're buying systems time to respond or change. I was super excited that this quote got used yesterday because it is one of my favorite quotes. I really think that it is the heart of what climate change is all about and what stationarity being dead is all about, is that the future ain't what it used to be. We used to have really strong assumptions about what the future would be like, and it would largely be exactly like the past, except with flying cars. But in fact, the future is going to be very different than what the past was like. There may not be flying cars as soon as people would. I'm not even going to say wish, because I still think the flying car is a terrible idea. People can't even drive cars in one dimension. The idea of 3 dimensions is terrible. Okay, so I'm now going to take you away from Montana, because I actually find one of the best ways to explain climate change adaptation to people at the get-go is to not confront them with things nearby, but to take you out of your space to somewhere else so that you can laugh at someone else's folly before we have to laugh at our own. So the world of species protection has largely been predicated on, whether it's an aquatic species or a terrestrial species, has been predicated on the idea of saving space. If we can protect the space where a species lives, then everything's going to be fine. Well, this fine fellow is a Florida key deer. It lives on 2 islands in the Florida Keys with a maximum elevation of 6 feet above sea level. I think you can see where this is going. Because of sea level rise and increased storm intensity, that idea of protecting the key deer wildlife refuge isn't really a viable long-term solution. The hurricane that went through the Florida Keys a couple of months ago actually decimated an estimated 14 to 25% of the remaining population of key deer. And that was just an episodic event. That's not the complete loss of all the land that they live on. So protecting space, maybe not the best solution. A little closer to home, you have another species that has a similar challenge. Pika live in habitat that really there's not a lot of competition for. There are not a lot of other things. People aren't saying, I really want to develop high Rocky Mountain talus. That seems like a great place to have a farm or build a house. But unfortunately, regardless of that pressure being gone, the Florida key deer are now on these 2 islands because of pressure of development and all the surrounding islands. The pika is affected because of warmer summers and, interestingly enough, warmer winters, which results in them not having a good snowpack. This year, pika are apparently pretty happy in this part of the world, I'm going to guess, because they are not freezing to death in the winter because of the lack of snow. But their space is protected, but climate change doesn't really care about your space. It used to be that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority was extremely smug in 1998 when the rest of the world saw a global coral bleaching event. They said, well, we have the largest marine protected area in the world. They did at the time, they don't anymore. And that is why our coral reefs didn't bleach. Well, 2 years later, their coral reefs also bleached because climate change does not care about the boundaries that we create. Restoration is another tool we use in protecting aquatic systems. Unfortunately, the whole idea of restoration, that at the beginning, assumes that you're returning things to a past state. Well, unfortunately, because of that no box, no stationarity thing anymore, the kinds of species that you would historically restore with, the ones that had lived on a site, had lived in a riparian zone, had lived in a lake, those are not the species that necessarily are moving into that space. So you could undergo a very large restoration effort that was undermined by increasing temperatures and rain shifts. And this example is actually from the Chesapeake Bay region, where they've been replacing bay grass with the species of bay grass that historically has lived in the Chesapeake and to the north. There's another species of bay grass that lives from the Chesapeake south, which might be the species that more of the restoration work should be done with, because that's the species that will be moving into the area. Water quality is a wide open space, and we're learning a lot about how climate change is affecting water quality. There's fortunately a lot of background work from the toxicological realm in how things like temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen concentrations all can affect water quality. But we've applied virtually none of that to how we monitor for water quality and how we actually regulate and protect water quality. So this is an example from Lake Champlain, where someone noticed that the synergy between changing precipitation patterns and changing phosphorus pollution were resulting in permanent non-compliance with the TMDL standards that had been created for the lake, yet the TMDL standards weren't being changed. And so that is the first case study of the EPA actually changing a TMDL because of climate change. But that same model has not been moved to the rest of the country. It is only being applied in the Lake Champlain region. So thinking about that on a local level is going to be really important, because protections that we have created to protect not only water quality for wildlife and natural systems, but also for human and public health, need to be revisited under a changing climate, because again, those past conditions that we assumed were forever ain't what they used to be. So, in the immortal words of Douglas Adams, I would ask you not to panic, because all of these problems have some level of solvability if we think about them differently. And there's a big element in that that will be the end of my litany of things that is not a simple solution, but it is something we need to be working on. So let me start by sort of breaking down some of the terminology that's used in the adaptation field. How many of you work in adaptation on a daily basis? Okay, so my words are not without need. Okay, so the first thing that happens in the world of adaptation is thinking about vulnerability. How will these changes affect what it is you care about? Hopefully this will not be a scenario that you will be seeing in Montana anytime soon. But it was actually the cover of a magazine that was trying to terrify people about climate change. There are sort of three categories of the kinds of adaptation options that people take. The first is resistance, which is how do you maintain things by protecting them. So the classic example of this is coastal systems installing seawalls to prevent the effects of sea level rise. Resistance has limitations. You can only resist change for so long, either because of technical limitations or cost limitations, or just because people suddenly realize that living on the coast behind a 10-foot wall isn't why they moved to live on the coast. Resilience is how do you set up a system to be able to respond to change, but you still have basically the same things there. And the example here is a floating home in the Netherlands, where the houses actually can go up with sea level rise. So they will not need to be rebuilt, and the coastline that they're on will not erode. I'm giving you hard infrastructure examples here, but all of these things are also translatable into natural systems. So resistance can be the attempt to continue to replant the same thing that's always been there to try and sustain it and keep it going. Resilience could be thinking about planting different species as systems change if you're doing a restoration project, or thinking about reducing non-climate stresses, or a host of other things that I'll go into in a few moments. And then response is like a tent. You're just going to pull up stakes and you're going to do something else. You're going to do what you're doing somewhere else, or you're going to do something else in the place that you are, because what historically has been the goal there isn't possible. So those three options, you should realize, are not mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive spatially or temporally. You can do these sequentially. You can do a mosaic of them to try and get the outcome you want, but those are sort of the 3 categories of the types of things that people do. And you'll hear more about those in the examples given later, and a couple simple examples that I'll give as I talk. But to actually operationalize this, some colleagues and I came up with 5 tenets that we think are really the 5 elements of the kinds of things that you can do. The first is to protect adequate and appropriate space for a changing world. And while I really want you to think temporally, not just spatially, I find that starting with spatial thinking is really useful because probably almost all of you use maps or some sort of physical demarcation as how you think about the way you do planning. So I'm easing into this. So there are all sorts of things you can take advantage of when you're thinking about climate change that exist on the natural landscape you already work on. Things like refugia, so places that aren't changing as quickly. So you can look at a map that has dark red areas and say, where are not the dark red areas? Where are those nice white areas on this map that aren't changing as quickly? You can look for gradients. Montana has a few of those, especially as you move farther west, that have to do with elevational, but there's also latitudinal gradients you can take advantage of. There's slope gradients you can take advantage of, and for some of your very large river systems, you have long riparian corridors. You want to take advantage of heterogeneity, and that's not just heterogeneity in terms of thinking about variability in genetics, although I'll get to genetics next, but it's just thinking about where can you have a variety of conditions in the system you're working on, so that you're essentially hedging your bets. Because one of the things you will notice in many climate projections is that you can't be told exactly when something's going to happen. And that shouldn't be surprising because you can't be told exactly when anything's going to happen in any of the kinds of decisions you make. But if you can plan for an array of contingencies by having a variety of conditions and systems in place, you probably end up with something pretty good at the end of the day. The next one is gene flow and connectivity. How can you think about how things can move? And a couple of these maps on the bottom are maps of connectivity corridors for aquatic species systems in Montana. And how can you think about populate source and sink populations for when things do experience episodic events, be they fire, drought, or flooding. And then you need to be thinking beyond just the location where you're working. You need to think about what is the larger watershed or landscape that I'm reliant on for making happen what I need to have happen in the system where I work. A second one, which is my favorite because I'm a reformed toxicologist, is reducing non-climate stresses. So how does climate change interact with all the other stresses that you've already been dealing with in the work you've been doing around water since you started your job ever? And these are things like unsustainable harvest. I found this White Mountain history photo of what was labeled by them on the website as unsustainable harvest from some year, a very long time ago. Invasive species and, so unsustainable harvest, if in fact you remove too much, you end up losing things like heterogeneity, you potentially lose some gene pool, and you potentially open yourself up to things like the invasives and pest species that are in the next box, which also are interacting with climate change. A lot of pest species and invasive species are moving into areas because of more favorable climatological conditions that have not been there historically. I just did a project in St. Paul, Minnesota, where all of the ash trees in St. Paul are dying. And we spent some time working with them on replanting all of the urban forest with species from several hardiness zones south that are going to be moving into the region so that they have essentially the urban tree canopy of the future that they're going to need because it is shockingly also getting hot in Minnesota. Agricultural and habitat fragmentation makes it harder for a lot of things to move and respond. There's a technique that's used in the world of climate adaptation planning called protecting the stage, which is about identifying places that have historically had high levels of endemism or high biodiversity, and saying that in the future those are probably also good bets. Well, if in fact species can't move to them because of habitat fragmentation or because the land is being used for something else, that's not going to be a great strategy. So we need to think about how climate change will interact with those things and how the practices that go on in that will also change. The way we're doing agriculture is changing. The agriculture industry is well aware of climate change, and they're changing treatments in terms of use of pesticides and fertilizer, which crops are happening where. I learned the other day that it'll be just like home when I start my sheep ranch here, because in fact you guys grow soybeans and corn now, so yay, welcome to Iowa North. And then the last one, which is my favorite, is pollution and habitat degradation. It's not really my favorite, but it's where my formal training is. And the interaction between those things is pretty dramatic. So this picture is actually here because this is my opportunity to apologize to the state of Montana. This is the coal strip power plant where I get my electricity from on Bainbridge Island in Washington. So thank you for hosting that. And I apologize for polluting both your air and your water. But the point is that both of those things, water pollution and air pollution, are exacerbated by climate change. Warmer air conditions increase a lot of formation of things like smog, but also the ability for the transport of pollutants on different patterns. And in aquatic systems, as I said earlier, there's that host of things that are affected. The third thing is to manage for uncertainty. Here are 3 futures that New York City will never actually see, but have been imagined by people both in the print media and the film world. But the point is that just like Montana, New York City will see flood, drought, and snowstorms. And planners plan for all those things. But we now also have to start planning for greater amounts of variability in the patterns in which those things happen and the intensity in which they happen, which means we have to have, again, those contingency plans. I like the BMW ad because when this ad came out was when they were fighting fuel efficiency standards, and I thought that was kind of funny that they were okay with that in so many ways. The fourth is that you can do things to reduce local and regional climate change, and some of that is things like protecting riparian corridors, riparian vegetation can protect local temperature and water quality conditions in a way that can ameliorate the effects of climate change. Protecting forest at lower elevations protects forest and cloud cover at higher elevations. Things like reintroduction of beaver or simulation of beaver, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, can also improve hydrology. And then you can do crazy things like they did in the Great Barrier Reef, where they actually put shade cloth over coral reefs. I doubt you'll be putting shade cloth over the run of a river anywhere in Montana. Finally, as I promised before, there's the big one, which is that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The 4 previous factors really just buy systems time. We actually need to do something to slow the rate and extent of climate change if, in fact, we're going to be able to manage systems at any level that is similar to what we're used to living in. Because these resilience options have serious limitations. And high elevation habitats, along with things like polar landscapes and oceans and drier regions, all really have thresholds at which they change dramatically. Which brings me to my friends at the Shutt Skateboard Company. This is their adaptation plan. They have put this forward that by 2086, they will move from skateboards to surfboards. And I use this to ask people, does this skateboard company have a better adaptation strategy than the city you live in or the agency you work for? And I fear that the answer is generally yes.